I walked into the Veterans Heritage Gala expecting to introduce the scholarship program my late wife and I had spent 8 years building. Instead, my former best friend stepped onto the stage, accepted an award meant for its founder, and thanked me for supporting his vision. Then he quoted a sentence from a private letter Eleanor wrote during our first year of fundraising. Only 3 people had ever read that letter. Eleanor was gone. I was standing in the audience, which left only one person who could have given him those words. If you've ever watched someone rewrite your life's work while everyone applauded, stay with me. The ballroom erupted in applause. Richard Collins smiled with the same easy confidence that had carried us through countless veterans' fundraising dinners over 2 decades. Most people in that room believed every word he said. For a moment, I almost did too. The plaque resting in his hands carried the scholarship program's emblem. Eleanor had designed it herself on our kitchen table one rainy Sunday afternoon. She always insisted that the eagle should face forward. "Scholarships are about tomorrow," she used to say. "Never yesterday." Richard continued speaking. "Our mission has always been giving military families opportunities they never imagined." Then he opened a folded page. "I'd like to share something that inspired me from the beginning." My heartbeat slowed. I recognized the paper before he read the first sentence. Eleanor's handwriting. Not the original letter. A printed copy. But the words were unmistakable. "Real service begins after the uniform comes off." She had written that line in a letter meant only for me after we received our first scholarship donation. Richard never should have known it existed. When the ceremony ended, people surrounded him with congratulations. Several donors shook my hand. "You must be proud." "I am." That answer wasn't entirely false. I was proud of every student who had received help through the program. I simply wasn't proud of the story now attached to it. Richard finally reached me. "Leonard, congratulations. I couldn't have done any of this without your support." Interesting. Not our work, not our program, only my vision. Marine Corps instruction taught me something valuable long before retirement. When someone quietly changes one word, pay attention. History often changes one word at a time. That evening, I returned home carrying the Gala program instead of the commemorative gift bag everyone else received. On my study wall hung the first scholarship photograph. 12 students, 1 folding table, 2 handwritten donation jars. Eleanor smiling in the center. I opened the storage cabinet where we kept the original founding records. The private letter should have remained sealed inside the archive box. The envelope was still there. But the security seal had been carefully lifted and pressed back into place. For the first time since Richard walked onto that stage, I stopped wondering why he accepted an award that belonged to someone else. I started wondering who else had quietly opened things that were never meant to leave our archives. The morning after the gala, I returned to the charity office before anyone else arrived. For nearly a decade, Eleanor and I had unlocked those doors together. She always carried coffee. I always carried the donor files. Some habits survive even after the people who created them no longer can. The archive cabinet stood exactly where it always had. Its brass lock showed no sign of damage. Neither did the file boxes. If someone had entered the records, they had done so with permission. That troubled me far more than a broken lock would have. Marine Corps instruction taught me that unauthorized entry creates one kind of problem. Authorized access used dishonestly creates another. I unlocked Eleanor's archive box. Every folder remained neatly arranged. Founding correspondence, volunteer rosters, early scholarship applications, original donor pledges. The private letter rested inside its envelope exactly where I remembered leaving it. Except the adhesive seal no longer matched. Someone had carefully opened it, then closed it again. I resisted the urge to become angry. Anger rarely improves observation. Instead, I reviewed the first donor ledger Eleanor and I assembled during the scholarship program's opening year. Every contribution had been handwritten before eventually entering the accounting software. Near the middle of the ledger, I noticed something unusual. 3 reserve fund transfers had been highlighted in pencil. Eleanor never used pencil, only blue ink. Someone else had added those marks later. I copied each transaction number into my notebook. Nothing more, no accusations. Just numbers. Late that morning, Richard stopped by unexpectedly. I figured I'd find you here. I've always liked quiet mornings. He smiled. Last night meant a lot. I'm sure it did. I hope there aren't any hard feelings. Interesting. Not did the award surprise you. Not should we talk? Only I hope there aren't any hard feelings. He already assumed I understood what had happened. I've never been interested in plaques. He visibly relaxed. I knew you'd understand. Another careful sentence. Not we built this together. Only you'd understand. Before leaving, he gently placed the commemorative Gala booklet on Eleanor's desk. I thought you'd want one. After he walked out, I opened it. Inside the back cover appeared a list of scholarship sponsors. One major donor had contributed substantially more than anyone else during the past year. That surprised me. The organization had never relied so heavily on a single contributor before. Later that afternoon, I met with Helen Brooks, a retired nonprofit auditor who had quietly volunteered with Eleanor from the very beginning. She studied the transaction numbers I copied from the ledger. You picked interesting ones. Why? They're reserve transfers. Scholarship money? Temporarily moved. For what? She frowned. That's what I'd like to know. Helen requested last year's financial summary. Several ordinary operating expenses appeared exactly where expected. Then she stopped. Leonard, what is it? One reserve transfer doesn't match any scholarship awards approved by the committee. I looked again. Every scholarship carried student names. Every grant carried approval dates. One large transfer carried neither. Only an internal authorization code. For the first time since Richard accepted that award, I realized the missing public credit might never have been the real objective. Someone had quietly moved something far more valuable than recognition. The unexplained reserve transfer stayed on my mind long after Helen Brooks closed the financial summary. One transaction without a scholarship recipient could have been an accounting mistake. Several connected together usually meant something else. Marine Corps instruction taught me that patterns deserve more attention than isolated errors. The next morning, I stopped visiting the charity office altogether. Instead, I publicly congratulated Richard in the organization's weekly newsletter. I thanked him for his years of leadership and wished him continued success with the scholarship program. Several board members immediately replied with appreciative messages. Richard called before lunchtime. I didn't expect that. I meant every word. I was worried you'd feel overlooked. I've learned recognition isn't the important part. He laughed with obvious relief. I always knew you understood the mission. Exactly what I wanted him to believe. Strategic surrender doesn't require pretending to be weak. Only allowing other people to believe they no longer need to hide. That afternoon, Helen invited me to review archived board records stored in the Community Foundation's basement. We've kept everything. I hope so. Most meeting minutes were ordinary. Volunteer schedules, fundraising goals, budget approvals. Then Helen quietly placed two versions of the same board meeting minutes beside one another. Notice anything? At first I didn't. The wording looked almost identical. Then I saw it. The original draft listed Eleanor and me as founding directors responsible for scholarship policy. The officially approved version listed Richard alone as founding visionary. My name had moved into an advisory role. Eleanor's disappeared completely. When was this changed? Helen checked the dates. About 18 months ago. No board vote? None recorded. History hadn't been rewritten during the gala. The gala merely celebrated a version already rewritten long before. Helen continued searching another storage box. Inside rested the original scholarship review sheets from the previous year. Each student application included evaluation notes from volunteer reviewers. Near the bottom of the stack, she stopped. Leonard, what now? Look at these approval numbers. The committee had recommended 38 scholarships. Only 31 appeared in the official annual report. 7 disappeared. So did their funding. At first, I assumed deserving students had simply declined the awards. Then Helen found the acceptance letters. All 7 students had accepted. Every one of them. The missing scholarships hadn't vanished before selection. They vanished afterward. Late that afternoon, Richard invited me to coffee. I've been thinking. So have I. I'd really like you to stand beside me during next month's donor banquet. Why? He smiled warmly. People trust seeing us together. Interesting. Not because we're friends. Not because you helped build this. Only because people trusted the appearance. As we left the cafe, I looked at Richard for several long seconds. I still wasn't convinced he understood everything happening behind the boardroom doors. Someone else seemed to be arranging pieces he had simply agreed to carry. That evening, Helen called one final time. I located the committee authorization log, and the 7 missing scholarships were never canceled. What happened? She quietly answered. Their reserve funds were reassigned under an emergency board authorization. For what purpose? I don't know yet. But whatever it was, it happened after the students had already been promised their futures. For the first time since Richard accepted that award, the investigation stopped being about stolen recognition. It became about 7 young people whose futures had quietly disappeared from the records without anyone daring to tell them why. 7 missing scholarships. That number followed me home like a shadow. I kept thinking about the acceptance letters Helen had uncovered. 7 young people had celebrated futures they believed were secure. 7 families had probably called grandparents, neighbors, and teachers with joyful news. And somewhere between celebration and tuition deadlines, someone quietly moved the money somewhere else. The gala suddenly looked very different. The stolen award had never been the destination. It had been camouflage. During my years teaching young Marines, I often reminded them that people rarely hide the objective. They hide the mechanism. The next morning, Helen and I met inside the Community Foundation archives. She had already requested the emergency authorization file connected to the missing reserve transfers. The folder arrived with surprisingly little paperwork. One board resolution, 2 signatures, 1 financial attachment. The attachment explained everything, or almost. The scholarship reserve account had issued what the board described as a temporary emergency liquidity loan. The borrower wasn't another charity. It wasn't a scholarship fund. It wasn't even a veterans organization. It was a manufacturing company owned by board member Charles Benton. I stared at the company name for several seconds. "I've heard of Benton Industrial." Helen nodded. "They've been losing contracts for nearly 2 years. So scholarship money became emergency financing, according to this paperwork. The loan carried a 6-month repayment promise. No competitive review. No donor approval. No scholarship committee authorization. Only emergency board discretion." Helen quietly turned another page. The repayment deadline had already passed. No repayment appeared anywhere in the financial records. Outside the archive room, we remained silent. Finally, Helen asked, "What matters most to you?" "My wife's name." She waited. "And those students?" She nodded. "You can't protect both by exposing everything today." She was right. If the charity collapsed immediately, hundreds of current scholarship recipients could lose support before replacement funding existed. That afternoon, Richard called. "We're meeting with major donors next Friday." "I'll be there." "I'm glad. They trust seeing us together." There it was again. Not friendship, not history. Trust. Someone needed donors believing nothing had changed. That evening, I reviewed Eleanor's original planning notebook. Every early meeting had been documented in her careful handwriting. One page caught my attention. She had written a simple sentence beside the very first scholarship budget. "Reserve funds must never support operating risk. Students come first." The words hit harder now than they had years earlier. She hadn't written a policy. She had written a warning. The following afternoon, Helen phoned with another discovery. I checked the audit calendar. "What did you find?" "The charity's independent financial review begins in 9 days. 9 days. Everything suddenly fit together. The Gala. Richard's public recognition, the rewritten history, the emergency loan, the missing scholarships. Someone needed the organization to appear stable until auditors arrived. A scandal before the audit would invite questions. A celebrated founder with donor confidence would discourage them. For the first time since standing in that ballroom, I understood the real question. It was no longer who deserved the award. It was whether I could expose the hidden loan before the audit while protecting every student who still believed the scholarship committee had kept its promises. 9 days before the audit. That deadline changed everything. Until then, I believed I was investigating a stolen legacy. Now I understood I was racing a calendar. If the auditors received incomplete information, the board might survive long enough to replace missing records before anyone asked difficult questions. If I acted too soon, the charity itself could collapse. And if the charity collapsed, hundreds of students who had done nothing wrong would become the first victims. That was exactly the choice someone wanted me to make. During my years training young Marines, I often reminded them that discipline meant choosing the mission over personal satisfaction. Some lessons become much harder after retirement. The following morning, I met Helen inside the scholarship committee office. Stacks of student applications covered the conference table. Some belonged to this year's recipients. Others waited for next month's review. Helen quietly slid one folder toward me. "You should read this." Inside was a letter from a 17-year-old applicant whose father had been permanently disabled during military service. The young woman wrote that receiving the scholarship would allow her to become the first person in her family to attend college. At the bottom, she had handwritten one sentence. "Someone believed in my future before I believed in it myself." I closed the folder slowly. Eleanor used to say almost the same words during every scholarship interview. For a long moment, neither Helen nor I spoke. Finally, she asked, "What matters now?" "The students." "And your name?" "It can wait." She nodded. "I hoped you'd say that." That afternoon, Richard stopped by my house carrying 2 donor appreciation plaques left over from the gala. "I thought you might like one." "I appreciate it." He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I know things haven't been easy." "For whom?" He hesitated. "For everyone." "Interesting." "Not for us. Not for you. Only for everyone." General language often hides very specific guilt. Before leaving, Richard quietly added, "The board's been under tremendous pressure." Pressure. The first honest word he had spoken since the gala. That evening, Helen called with another discovery. "I finally located the emergency loan file." "What did you find?" "The money wasn't transferred directly." "It wasn't?" "No. It moved through a temporary reserve account first." "Why?" "Because that account doesn't appear in the annual donor summary." The mechanism suddenly became clear. Scholarship reserves hadn't disappeared. They had been hidden long enough to avoid ordinary reporting. Late that night, I returned to Eleanor's study. Inside her desk rested the original handwritten mission statement for the scholarship program. Beside it lay the first donor agreement every contributor had signed. One paragraph immediately caught my attention. "Scholarship reserve funds shall never be pledged, loaned, or redirected for operational or commercial purposes." Every donor had agreed to that promise. Every board member had inherited responsibility for protecting it. For the first time since Richard accepted the Founder's Award, I understood what Eleanor's private letter had truly been protecting. Not our reputation. A principle. Just before midnight, Helen called again. "The audit committee meets privately 2 days before the full financial review." "So they still have one last chance?" "Yes. To correct everything before the auditors arrive." I carefully returned Eleanor's mission statement to its folder. Someone on that board still had an opportunity to choose honor over concealment. The question was whether anyone would take it before I was forced to make the decision for them. 4 days remained before the independent audit. By then, I knew exactly how the scholarship money had been moved. What I still didn't know was whether anyone on the board intended to stop the deception before the auditors forced them to. That distinction mattered. During my years training Marines, I believed leadership wasn't measured by avoiding mistakes. It was measured by what people chose after they understood the consequences. The following morning, Helen called before sunrise. The audit committee meets this afternoon. So today's their chance. Yes. If they reverse the transfers now, the students can still be protected. And the charity? It has a chance. I hung up and drove to the Veterans Memorial where Eleanor and I used to meet scholarship recipients every Memorial Day. The bronze flagpole still stood beside the stone walkway. The engraved bricks carried hundreds of family names. One brick simply read, "Service continues." Eleanor insisted on those words. She believed service never ended with retirement. That morning they reminded me that protecting the scholarship mattered more than defending my pride. By noon, Helen arrived carrying a sealed audit folder. I've organized everything. Inside rested the complete financial chronology. Original donor agreements. Reserve account transfers. Emergency loan approvals. Board resolutions. Committee recommendations. Student acceptance letters. And finally, Eleanor's handwritten mission statement. Every document fit together. No missing pages. No assumptions. Only a timeline. Track A had finally become Track B. The stolen award had led us to the financial records. Now those same records could establish accountability without relying on anyone's confession. Helen looked at me carefully. "Are you going to show them today?" "No." She seemed surprised. "They deserve one last opportunity." "Why?" "Because once the auditors receive this, there won't be any quiet way back." Late that afternoon, Richard stopped by unexpectedly. His smile looked tired for the first time in weeks. "The committee meeting didn't go well." "No." "They're nervous." "About what?" "The audit." He sat across from me in complete silence for several seconds. Then he quietly asked, "If mistakes were made?" I waited. "Do you think people deserve a second chance?" There it was. Not denial. Not innocence. The first honest question he had asked since the gala. "I think they deserve the chance to tell the truth before someone else has to." He lowered his eyes. "They're afraid donors will leave." "What are you afraid of?" He answered so softly, I almost missed it. "Losing everything we built." I wanted to tell him we had already begun losing it the moment truth became negotiable. Instead, I simply nodded. "You still have time." He stood slowly. "I'll think about that." As he drove away, I realized he had just received the final opportunity my conscience required me to give him. Whether he accepted it was no longer my decision. That evening, Helen called. The board voted, and they approved leaving the financial reports unchanged. I closed the audit folder. Someone had consciously chosen concealment after fully understanding the consequences. The choice was no longer theirs. Tomorrow, the auditors would receive every original document Eleanor and I had protected from the beginning. Until then, the board still believed I had accepted the award ceremony, accepted the rewritten history, and quietly walked away. Only Helen knew that the complete audit chronology had never left my possession. And that was exactly where it needed to remain until morning. The auditors arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, carrying nothing more threatening than notebooks, laptops, and polite smiles. Most people inside the charity headquarters believed the review would last 2 days before ending with a routine report. The board members looked confident. Richard looked exhausted. Helen Brooks quietly sat beside me with the sealed audit chronology resting inside a plain brown portfolio. No one outside the two of us knew what it contained. During my years as a Marine instructor, I often reminded young leaders that discipline meant waiting until evidence could speak louder than emotion. This was that moment. The lead auditor began with ordinary questions. Annual donations, scholarship distributions, reserve balances, board approvals. Everything sounded organized. Everything sounded responsible. Then he reached one simple question. Can you explain the emergency reserve transfer authorized last year? Board member Charles Benton answered immediately. It was a temporary liquidity adjustment. The auditor nodded. Supporting which charitable purpose? Silence. Charles glanced toward Richard. Richard looked down at the conference table. No one answered. Helen quietly slid the sealed portfolio toward me. I stood. I believe these documents answer the question. The lead auditor accepted the folder. Inside were the original donor agreements, the scholarship committee recommendations, the student acceptance letters, the reserve transfer chronology, the emergency loan authorization. And finally, Eleanor's handwritten mission statement, written years before the organization had ever become successful. The room remained completely silent while the auditor reviewed each page. No dramatic speeches, no raised voices, only paper. Finally, he stopped at the donor agreement. He read one sentence aloud. Scholarship reserve funds shall never be pledged, loaned, or redirected for operational or commercial purposes. He looked toward Charles. Did the board authorize a commercial loan using these reserves? Charles shifted uneasily. It was temporary. The auditor turned another page. The repayment deadline expired 5 months ago. Another silence. Richard finally stood. I need to say something. Everyone looked toward him. He took a long breath. Leonard didn't lose that Founder's Award because I earned it. He looked directly at me. I accepted it because the board believed donors would trust the organization more if I appeared completely responsible for its direction. He paused. I convinced myself protecting the charity mattered more than protecting the truth. No one interrupted. He continued quietly. I never intended scholarship money to be endangered. Charles immediately spoke. The loan would have been repaid. The auditor calmly answered. Intentions are not financial controls. Charles had no reply. Helen then presented the altered board minutes beside the original draft. The differences required no explanation. The founding history had been rewritten. The emergency transfers had been concealed. The missing scholarships had been reassigned. Every document reinforced the next. Track A had become Track B exactly as Eleanor always believed careful records eventually would. The lead auditor closed the portfolio. Effective immediately, these findings require an independent governance review, restoration of restricted scholarship reserves, and notification of all affected donors. No applause followed. No celebration. Only quiet accountability. Outside the building, Richard caught up with me before I reached my truck. I should have stopped it. You still could have. I know. I thought saving the organization required sacrificing your name. I gently shook my head. It required protecting the students. He looked toward the Veterans Memorial across the street. So what happens now? I watched volunteers helping scholarship recipients prepare for orientation photographs. The charity survives. And us? I answered honestly. That will take longer. As I drove away, I realized the award had never truly belonged to me. Honor had always belonged to the promises Eleanor and I made to students whose futures depended on people keeping their word. 3 months after the audit, the scholarship program was still standing. So were the students. That mattered more to me than any plaque ever could. The independent review required the charity to restore every dollar taken from the Scholarship Reserve Fund. The emergency loan was recovered through negotiated repayments and new board oversight. Every one of the 7 students whose awards had been delayed received the funding they had originally been promised. No celebration announced the restoration. The letters simply arrived. Sometimes quiet justice looks exactly like that. Richard resigned from the board before the final governance report was released. Several weeks later, he came to my house carrying the Founder's Award. He placed it gently on the porch table. It belongs here. I looked at the plaque for several moments before answering. No. He looked confused. It belongs where people remember why it exists. Together we drove to the scholarship office. Inside the entrance stood a simple display honoring every volunteer who had helped build the program since its beginning. I handed the plaque to the executive director. I'd like this displayed here. Under whose name? I smiled. Under the mission. A month later, the entrance was redesigned. The award stood beneath a framed copy of Eleanor's handwritten mission statement. Below it, a bronze plate carried just one sentence. Honor belongs to those who protect the promise. No individual names, no founders, no presidents, only the purpose. One Saturday afternoon, I watched new scholarship recipients gather for orientation. Among them were the 7 students whose futures had nearly disappeared inside an accounting ledger. One young woman paused before Eleanor's framed mission statement. She quietly read every word. Then she smiled. I hope I make someone this proud someday. I never introduced myself. I didn't need to. The mission had finally become more important than the people who created it. As I walked outside, I realized Eleanor had been right all those years ago. The eagle she designed for the scholarship emblem always faced forward, never backward. If this story reminded you that real honor is measured by the lives we protect rather than the recognition we receive, carry that lesson into your own community. Defend truth with patience. Protect promises even when no one is watching. And remember that the strongest legacy is often the one that quietly continues serving others long after our own names begin to fade. God bless every veteran, every volunteer, every student chasing a better future, and every quiet steward who chooses integrity over applause.